Part 2. Normative Ethics. Doing the Right Thing. Chapter 5. Morality and Religion. 3 assumptions about morality and religion. Religion has always been the most popular source of morality. In times of need and moral perplexity, religious believers consult priests, rabbis, imams, they avidly read their sacred texts, they look for guidance to long-standing religious traditions. All of this is perfectly natural. Since hundreds of millions of people view morality through the lens of one religion or another, it is important that we examine this relationship carefully. We aren't going to try to determine here whether God exists, nor are we going to explore specific doctrines that separate one religion from another. Instead, I want to take a step back and examine 3 central assumptions that underlie the widespread view that morality depends on religion. 1. Religious belief is needed to get us to do our duty. 2. Morality must be created by someone, and God is by far the best candidate for the job. 3. Religious wisdom is the key to providing us with moral guidance. Let's examine these assumptions in order. First assumption: religious belief is needed for moral motivation. A popular argument in favor of the religious life states that atheism, the view that God does not exist, prevents us from seeing why we should be moral. And if we are blinded to our reasons to be good, then we will probably be bad. Without belief in God, people are more likely to stray from the path of virtue. It will be harder for them to sacrifice self-interest when duty calls. But once God is in the picture, our will is strengthened. Religious people are going to be more conscientious than atheists or agnostics, those who are unsure whether God exists or not. This may be true. If it is, what would explain it? The most popular answer cites our fear of God and our desire for a happy afterlife. The thought of spending eternity in flames or divorced from God's love is a pretty powerful check on our immoral impulses. If God exists, justice will eventually be done, and woe then to the sinner. Good deeds will be rewarded, if not here on earth, then in another worldly paradise. So believers have very strong reasons to be moral. Non-believers don't have such reasons. They will therefore fall more easily into temptation. Suppose this is correct. Still, this wouldn't show that religious people are more likely to do good. It would only show that they are more likely to be conscientious. But being conscientious doesn't always translate into doing good. Some of the leaders of the Inquisition were very conscientious. Their conscience led them to torture their victims in an intensely cruel way. Religious conviction may strengthen our commitments, but religion has sometimes asked its followers to wage war, not peace, to kill, to take the land and wealth of others, and to destroy the cultures of non-believers. Religion doesn't always help us to become better people. It all depends on whether the religious principles we believe in are morally good in the first place. But let's imagine a best-case scenario, one in which our religious views are morally attractive, and suppose the religious believers really are more likely than non-believers to be conscientious. What would this show? It would not show that God exists, nor would it show that morality depends in any way upon God. Rather, it is an argument for the practical benefits of certain religious beliefs. It says that believers with morally good views are more likely than non-believers to do the right thing. Yet the benefits of holding a belief are one thing, its truth another. For all that this reasoning shows, religious beliefs may simply be useful fictions, false beliefs that do a lot of good. I'm not saying that this is so. In fact, let us grant, for argument's sake, that some set of religious beliefs is correct. Still, this account of how religious belief strengthens our moral motivations is problematic. The reason is simple. If hope for heavenly reward or fear of God's anger is what prompts us to do good, then we may well do the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. To see this, imagine a person who does her duty, but only because she thinks that God punishes those who misbehave and rewards those who act morally. Such a person is not well motivated. She is doing her duty not because she loves God, but rather because she sees God as threatening the worst punishments or offering the best bribes. Such a person is unreliably moral, for if she came to believe that God really didn't offer the expected rewards and punishments, then she would see no reason to be moral. Fear of God has been a traditional way to get people to do their duty, but when it is effective, it undermines moral character rather than supports it. People who deserve our praise and admiration are those who do their duty for its own sake. Rather than acting from ulterior self-interested motives, they do what is right because it is right. Agnostics and atheists have just as much reason to adopt this attitude as theists, those who believe in God's existence, do. Even if fear of God is the most effective way to get people to do what they should, this would not show that God exists. It would not show that religious beliefs are correct. Nor would it show that atheists or agnostics are unable or unlikely to behave in morally admirable ways. Being well motivated requires a love and respect for the morally important things in life. Religion has often fostered such an outlook, but it isn't required to do the job. Second assumption: God is the creator of morality. If God is dead, then everything is permitted. Many people feel the force of this thought recorded by one of Dostoevsky's characters in his novel The Brothers Karamazov. On this view, atheism spells the doom of morality. The underlying idea seems to be this: because morality is a set of norms, i.e. standards that we ought to live up to, there must be someone with the authority to create them. Without God, there is no one but we human beings to make up the moral law. And we lack the needed authority to do the work. Our say-so doesn't make things right. Our disapproval cannot make things wrong. We are limited in understanding and bound to make mistakes. A morality built upon our imperfections would lack credibility. But a morality created by God, that is a different story entirely. After all, God is wholly perfect. What better credentials could there be for drafting a moral code? Add to these credentials the following vision. Imagine a godless universe, lacking any divine purpose. Where would moral norms come from? If we are wholly material beings governed by physical laws, then there are many ways that we will behave, but there seems to be no way that we ought to behave. If we are just very complex bundles of matter without any externally imposed aims or purposes to live up to, then it is difficult to see how there can be moral duties at all. To get moral requirements into the picture, we must have someone with the authority to impose these duties on us. Only God could possibly qualify. This vision of God's role in morality as its ultimate author, the one who makes up the moral code, rests on a crucial assumption: that morality must be created by someone. This assumption serves as the first premise of a popular argument for God's creation of morality. 1. Every law requires a lawmaker. 2. Therefore, the moral law requires a lawmaker. 3. Humans cannot be the author of the moral law since we are imperfect in so many ways. 4. If humans cannot be the author of the moral law, then God is its author. 5. Therefore, God is the author of the moral law. This line of thinking leads directly to the following view, known to philosophers as the divine command theory. An act is morally required just because it is commanded by God, and immoral just because God forbids it. I think that this is the natural, default view for a religious believer when thinking of God's relation to morality, but it is not without its problems. There are two of them. One is obvious. The divine command theory makes morality depend on God's commands, but God may not exist, or as deists believe, God may exist but may not command us to do anything. Deists claim that God set creation in motion and then retired to survey his universe, refusing to involve himself in human affairs. If the divine command theory is true, and if either atheism or deism is correct, then nothing is right or wrong. Morality would be a complete sham. But let's assume that God does exist, and does care enough about us to tell us what to do. Still, there is a significant problem with the theory, a problem that was first recognized by Plato about 2.5 millennia ago. In the Euthyphro, a short dialogue concerning the nature of piety, Plato has the title character pompously blabbing about what is and isn't pious. In response to Socrates' asking for its essence, Euthyphro declares that piety is whatever is loved by the gods. Socrates then poses the following question: do the gods love actions because they are pious, or are actions pious because the gods love them? Euthyphro immediately starts to get nervous, a very reasonable response. Socratic interrogation rarely leaves your pride intact. Euthyphro thinks that the first option is the better one. He is right, but for the wrong reasons as it happens. By the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro is humbled and we are enlightened. With a few substitutions, we can get a newer version of Socrates' question that is more relevant to our topic. Does God command us to do actions because they are morally right, or are actions morally right because God commands them? The divine command theory answers our new question by affirming the second option. Actions are morally right just because God insists that we perform them. Prior to God's commands, nothing was right or wrong. Morality simply didn't exist. The first option says that God commands actions because they are right. This implies that God did not invent morality, but rather recognized an existing moral law and then commanded us to obey it. But God created everything, therefore he also created morality. Therefore, the first option is impossible. But it is not impossible. In fact, it is the option that theists ought to prefer. Indeed, most religious philosophers reject the divine command theory. To see why, let us suppose that the theory is correct. Now imagine the point at which God is choosing a morality for us. God contemplates the nature of rape, torture, and treachery. What does he see? Being omniscient, all-knowing, God sees such actions for what they are. Crucially, he sees nothing wrong with them. They are, at this point, morally neutral. Nothing as yet is right or wrong. But God did at some point make a decision. He forbade rape, theft, and most kinds of killing. If the divine command theory is correct, then he didn't forbid them because they were immoral. So why did God forbid them? It may be presumptuous of us to try to answer that question, but we can ask a slightly different question. Did God have reasons for his decisions or not? If the divine command theory is true, then there is trouble either way. If God lacks reasons for his commands, if there is no solid basis supporting his decisions to prohibit certain things and require others, then God's decisions are arbitrary. It would be as if God were creating morality by a coin toss, but that is surely implausible. That sort of God would be arbitrary and thus imperfect. So a perfect God must have had excellent reasons for laying down the moral law as he did. But then these reasons and not God's commands are what make actions right or wrong. Actions are not right because God commands them. Whatever reasons support God's choices also explain why actions have the moral status they do. Suppose, for instance, that God really did forbid us from torturing others. God must have had very good reasons for doing so. While we can't presume to know God's thoughts, let's just assume for now that God based his decision on the fact that torture is extremely painful, humiliating, and an attack on a defenseless person. Assuming that these are the relevant questions, then the reasons, and not God's say-so, are what makes torture immoral. These reasons can fully explain why torture is wrong. Torture is wrong because it is extremely painful, humiliating, and so on. God's condemnation does not turn a morally neutral act into an immoral one. Rather, God recognizes what is already bad about torture. There is something in the very nature of torture that makes it morally suspect. Since God knows everything, God knows what is detestable about torture. Since God wants us to be good, God orders us not to attempt such actions. God commands us to refrain from torture because torture is immoral. The Euthyphro argument summarizes this line of thinking. 1. Either God has reasons that support his commands, or God lacks reasons for his commands. 2. If God lacks reasons for his commands, then God's commands are arbitrary, and that renders God imperfect, undermining his moral authority. 3. If God has reasons that support his commands, then these reasons, rather than the divine commands, are what make actions right or wrong, thereby refuting the divine command theory. 4. Therefore, either God is imperfect or the divine command theory is false. 5. God is not imperfect. 6. Therefore, the divine command theory is false. To avoid portraying God as arbitrary, we must assume that he issues commands based on the best possible reasons. And here are the best possible reasons. God sees that an action such as torture is immoral, sees with perfect understanding that such things as kindness and compassion are good, and then issues the divine commands on the basis of this flawless insight. This picture preserves God's omniscience and integrity, but it comes at the expense of the divine command theory and God's authorship of the moral law. And after all, what is the alternative? If there is nothing intrinsically wrong with rape or theft, then God could just as well have required that we do such things. He could have forbidden that we be generous or thoughtful, but this makes a mockery of morality and our view of God as morally perfect. The divine perfection argument expresses this point. 1. If the divine command theory is true, then a morally perfect God could have created a flawless morality that required us to rape, steal, and kill, and forbade us from any acts of kindness or generosity. 2. A morally perfect God could not have issued such commands. Anyone who did so would be morally imperfect. 3. Therefore, the divine command theory is false. The first premise is certainly true. The divine command theory says that God's choices wholly determine morality and that nothing determines God's choices. If God's choices were fixed in advance, the only plausible explanation would be that certain kinds of actions were already right and others already wrong, and that God, in his infinite wisdom, knew this and issued his commands accordingly. But that is to deny the central idea of the divine command theory. The second premise is highly plausible. A moral code that required such horrific acts and forbade such good ones could not be authored by someone worthy of love and worship, someone fit to serve as a model of moral perfection. In my experience, many religious people still feel suspicious about rejecting the divine command theory. They worry that the theory is needed to preserve God's perfection. If God doesn't create the moral law, then how can he be perfect? True, abandoning the divine command theory does mean giving up the view that God is the author of morality. But this is actually needed in order to preserve God's perfection. It allows us to say that God is perfectly wise, perfectly moral, and perfect in his love for us. Being infinitely wise, he knows all that is good and evil. Being morally perfect, he flawlessly measures up to the highest moral ideals. Caring for his human creatures, he passes along some of that wisdom to us to better guide our lives. Further, if we reject the divine command theory, then this allows us to say that God bases his commands on the best possible reasons. There is no room in this picture for the sort of arbitrariness that would undermine divine perfection. If this is all on the right track, then we can see that the pessimism of Dostoevsky's thought is misguided. The absence of God does not mean the absence of morality. God is not needed to create the moral law. Indeed, a perfect God is one who fully understands, embraces, and adheres to a moral law, not of his own making. A perfect God cannot create morality through his whims. If God cannot be morally mistaken, it is because his understanding is perfect. But when it comes to morality, it is the understanding of one who does not author the moral law, but rather completely knows that law and the reasons that support it. Third assumption, religion is an essential source of moral guidance. Theists are often reluctant to reject the divine command theory because they think that rejecting it leaves God entirely out of the moral picture, but it doesn't. Suppose that God exists but is not the author of the moral law. God could still play a crucial role in morality, not by being its inventor, but by being its infallible reporter and our expert guide. God knows everything, including every single detail of the moral law, and if God is all-loving, then God will want to share some of that wisdom with us. How will he do it? By means of revelation, either personal and direct, say by talking to you or giving you signs of certain kinds, or by indirect means, say by inspiring the authors of a Bible. Importantly, religious believers who reject the divine command theory could easily accept the following claim. An act is morally required if God commands it, and is immoral if God forbids it. This looks like the divine command theory, but it is importantly different. This view does not claim that acts are right and wrong because of God's commands. God's commands don't make actions right or wrong, but if God exists, then his verdict is nonetheless morally decisive. God will never make a mistake. If God commands you to do something, then morally speaking, the matter is settled. God doesn't have to be the author of morality in order to play a vital role in teaching us how to live. We can see this by considering an analogy. Imagine a perfectly accurate thermometer. If we wanted to know the temperature, we'd look to this device. But the thermometer is not creating the temperature, it is recording it in an error-free way. If we reject the divine command theory, then God is playing a similar role regarding morality. He is not creating the moral law, he is telling us what it is in a way that is never mistaken. There are some worries, of course. Here are some worth mentioning. Those who are not religious will need to look elsewhere for moral guidance, and they may be right to do so since God may not exist. Further, God may exist and yet not offer any advice to us. This is the God of the deists. To rightly trust religious texts or religious authority, you must first have reason to believe that God exists and relays more wisdom to us than the reverse. Even if God exists and offers us moral advice, there are still two serious problems for those who seek divine guidance. We must select a source of religious wisdom from among many choices, and we must know how to interpret that source. These two problems can be illustrated by working through a popular argument from religious authority. 1. If the Bible prohibits abortion, then abortion is immoral. 2. The Bible prohibits abortion. 3. Therefore, abortion is immoral. The first premise asserts the moral authority of the Bible. But which Bible? Different religions offer us different sacred texts, whose details sometimes contradict one another. So we must choose. There is presumably one right choice and many wrong ones. The odds are stacked against us. Premise 1 is plausible only if God has authored the Bible or dictated its terms. Religious believers therefore have to make a case that this is so. They must justify the claims that God exists, that God has communicated with humanity, and that their favorite Bible is the one that contains God's wisdom. It won't be easy to do this. If God is all-powerful, then he could provide some extremely clear, undeniable evidence to settle these matters, evidence that would convince agnostics, atheists, and members of competing religions. But God has thus far chosen not to do this. That makes defense of premise 1 especially tricky. And the challenges don't end there. Even if theists can adequately defend the first premise and so justify the selection of their preferred Bible, there is the further matter of how to interpret the sacred text. Neither the Hebrew nor the Christian scriptures, for instance, ever explicitly mentions abortion, much less prohibits it. Thus, even if you wanted to adopt a literal reading of those scriptures, problems will arise. There will be many important topics, such as abortion, that are never mentioned in the crucial text. Those that are mentioned may receive contradictory treatments. Consider, as an early example, the literally incompatible creation stories of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. There may also be morally troubling advice on offer. Think of the passages in Leviticus that permit slavery and the subordination of women, or those that require killing adulterers and disrespectful children. Yet, if we move away from a literal reading, we are faced with countless possibilities for interpreting the biblical texts. Believers must choose among them and justify their choice in the face of a wide number of conflicting approaches. A defense of premise 2 is therefore no easy matter. A final difficulty comes when having to balance the demands of a sacred text with the layers of tradition that form a crucial part of any living religion. When your interpretation of a religious document conflicts with long-standing religious practice or the advice of generations of religious authorities, which should win out? Consider as an example the famous eye for an eye principle, which seems to be clearly required by God in the Hebrew Scriptures, Exodus 21:23, Leviticus 24:20, Deuteronomy 20:21. Yet Jewish communities and their religious leaders have, for at least 2 millennia, read the decree in an imaginative, non-literal way, softening its implications for wrongdoers and extending the principle to apply to cases where it cannot be taken literally. Does the text take priority over traditional practice and religious authority, or is it the other way around? Believers must have a plausible view about how to settle such conflicts. Without one, their take on what God really wants for us may be very wide of the mark. To summarize, those who seek divine guidance in trying to lead a moral life may succeed, but several conditions must be met. It must be the case that 1, God exists and that we can be justified in believing this. 2, God must offer us moral advice and we must be able to defend the claim that he does so. Further, 3, theists must be justified in selecting a particular source of religious and moral wisdom, such as the Quran, the Book of Mormon, or the Christian scriptures. Theists must also, 4, defend specific interpretations of those sources. Finally, when an interpretation conflicts with tradition, religious believers must, 5, successfully argue for the priority of one over the other. This is a daunting list, yet philosophy is full of such lists, and the difficulty of a project is not by itself proof of its failure. Religious believers have their work cut out for them, no doubt of it, but then so does everyone else. Conclusion. There's a great deal to think about when discussing the relation between morality and religion. I have narrowed the focus to 3 major assumptions because these seem to lie at the heart of most debates about God's role in morality. Is God needed to ensure that we are morally motivated? No. Morally admirable behavior comes from when we do our duty for its own sake rather than from self-interest. Fear of God or desire for heavenly reward do not necessarily tarnish our character, but they are no substitute for a direct love of morality, which can be displayed as much by atheists as by religious believers. Does God create morality? No, rather God, if he exists, understands everything and so knows precisely what is wrong with such things as rape and torture and right about such things as compassion and kindness. He issues commands on the basis of this perfect understanding out of love for his creatures. A God who issues commands for good reasons will rely on the very best reasons, and those can explain all by themselves what is right and wrong. Does religion offer reliable moral guidance? Possibly. That depends on many things. Whether God exists and speaks to us, whether we can know which texts are divinely written or inspired, whether we can defend our favored interpretations against the competition, and whether we can balance these interpretations against the importance of religious tradition and authority in cases of conflict. In the rest of the book, I do not make use of specifically religious claims. There are two reasons for this. First, we have seen in many challenges to the assumption that morality is based on religion, and it is worthwhile seeing how far we can get without having to rely on that assumption. Second, there is important precedent among religious philosophers for thinking that God gave us reasons and understanding in order to make the fundamental truths of morality available to everyone. After all, a caring God would want even non-believers to understand the immorality of rape and genocide and to appreciate the goodness of generosity and loving kindness. Let us proceed then to consider the views of those who in most cases were religious themselves but sought secular foundations for the moral theories they developed.